Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Aparuta de sangamatassa tawara e sodavanta bamunjantu satang. So abiding in the silence is here and now. The noise is external noise that we hear, or the busyness of our thoughts, our habits. And then there's the Puto, the aware, the witness of movement and change of our own thoughts, emotions, as different as the conditions change in the present. So our worldly minds, our conditioned minds, are very much built on the good and bad, right and wrong, success and failure, heaven and hell, male and female, and on like that. So every perception has its object, the positive or the negative. So when we approach meditation, we want to progress in meditation. We see meditation as something that we have to progress in, achieve, be successful. So when we first become interested in Buddhist meditation, whether it's monastics or lay people, the conditioning of the mind is to progress. And so in many ways, Buddhist meditation can be taught in what they call the gradual path, which always seems like a progress. And then there's the instant enlightenment practice of wisdom, which progress we see as another condition we cling to. So many people, in my experience as a monk, in teaching meditation to others, and my own experience is to see myself progressing, or I'm reached a limit, a wall, I'm not progressing in my practice. The mind can, after years of trying to progress in practice, then all the techniques, all the ways that we approach meditation aren't working anymore. It's what we call a wall, or you can't go any further. So the wisdom, universal wisdom, isn't about progress or regress or walls or anything. It's about here and now. So that's why I encourage you to really investigate your own personality, to how you see yourself as an individual person, as a man or woman, monk or lay person. Just to observe, the the separateness, the feeling of separateness and progress is about, our perception, concepts generated out of the changing conditions that we experience through the senses, through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, through the mind. Everything's changing. And change implies both the progress and degeneration. And so that the attitude of achieving or succeeding in meditation or getting past the wall, being stuck in a valley, not getting any more peaceful states of mind, no matter how hard you try, reaching the wall, and you think, I'm not progressing in my meditation. Or is it that you need to change your attitude about progress and meditation? These are just words, convenient words that we use. And they work quite well in terms of teaching others, and in our teaching ourselves. We need concepts and words, and we have this tradition has the Pali language, the Thai language, to kind of give different kind of meaning to many English words that we use in teaching Dhamma here in the United States. But the words themselves are concepts that are created. They're impermanent conditions. And no matter how hard we cling to good concepts, we still suffer, because the world that we live in is changing, and we're changing. What we identify with is a kind of belief in ourselves as a permanent, separate person. And so, like, I am Ajahn Sumedho can be a very fixed position for me. And then you can investigate, am I Ajahn Sumedho when I'm asleep? And then people ask, I'd like to see Ajahn Sumedho, and they said, he's asleep. And so on the conventional level, that makes sense. Maybe I am asleep. Maybe I'm not asleep. But that's not the point. The point is, what doesn't sleep? If I am just a separate entity in the universe that sleeps, then when I can't sleep, then I want to take sleeping pills or drink chamomile tea or do something or other because I like to go into the state where I'm no longer awake. Most of us like to sleep. But when the body is sleeping, when the consciousness is not active, focusing on objects anymore, what is still present here and now? And you're not dead. Body's not dead. It's breathing. Its internal organs are functioning, and on like that. So it isn't that the body's dead unless the body dies, when that's no longer capable of functioning. When the organs don't work, the senses don't work, then we call that death. But what dies is the conditions, and that's the nature of conditioned phenomena. It's reached that. It can't go beyond death. So we create imaginary states that are after death what remains. And we have this, in the Western world, view of a soul, a separate soul, or we don't believe in a separate soul. We can believe in the oblivion. Once you're dead, that's the end of everything. Or we believe in reincarnation, that we'll be reborn as in some other form. And we see that in very personal. In a previous life, I was such and such. And there's a lot of fascinating stories about reincarnation, rebirth, and on like that, because it is a kind of one way of explaining. Because it's it's an interesting question. What happens after death? And, then in terms of concepts, then we have beliefs. Like reincarnation is a belief. Heaven and hell is a belief. Oblivion is a belief. Because we don't know, bodies are still breathing, still alive. So when we identify with the body, then we see death as a rather, and we can make horror movies about zombies and ghosts and unlike that, imagining all kinds of things, because the imagination of a living individual, it can be quite active. And it is a mystery in terms of the way we interpret ourselves and life that we live. Because as a person, none of us know what happens after death. But we'll all find out, if that's good news. But the idea of progress is this belief in time as our reality. Time is where things, the conditioned realm, we experience the conditioned realm in time. The four elements, the earth, fire, water, air elements, space, and sensory consciousness are all changing conditions in terms of the reality of every living being. But we can create images, imagine. We've got vivid imaginations. We can create images of perfection, of hell, of nothingness. Once you're dead, that's the end of everything. But we don't know. And that very fact, we don't know, was where wisdom begins to manifest, where we begin to use wisdom rather than just trying to believe or disbelieve in the various concepts about birth and death. So then, to the Buddha, life was an investigation. So his teachings aren't about progress and development and about walls and about what happens when you get dementia, Alzheimer's, you lose your memory. Then who are you? So we imagine, we can imagine all kinds of things about getting old, suffering from dementia, loss of memory, Alzheimer's disease are kind of perceptions that are very common now in modern life in the Western world. Because because the societies we live in are all based on youth, on the idea of progress, the idea of good health, the idea of, really beautiful ideals. But the wisdom is not there to understand that ideals are not reality. We don't experience ideals. We imagine them. And they can be very harmful ideals about hell and eternal punishment and being reborn as a frog, something like that. You can imagine you could be reborn as an amoeba or an earthworm or a pig. The imagination has no limits in terms of forms that we're all capable of imagining. But imagining is a condition. Images are all conditions. They arise and cease. So in terms of politics, for example, we want progress. We have ideals, concepts of an ideal political system, and then communism was an ideal political system. Socialism is an ideal political system. Democracy is an ideal political system. They're all images of perfection. So it's not that there's anything wrong with any of them, but we tend to, out of conditioning, be programmed to take sides. In the United States, we're Democrats, or to vilify others, we call them communists and socialists. Because those words in the culture of this country have negative qualities to them. Where democracy, I'm all for democracy, it gets you elected into the government. So just to see how, and religion itself is full of concepts. It's about concepts of belief. And these are, in terms of Dhamma, they're all conventions. All religions are conventional. Political systems are conventional. They're attempts to reach perfection. For example, communism, the idea of where everything's equal and fair, and there's no rich or poor, and it's taking the ideal to an ultimate extreme. But then it's not in touch with the reality of the human condition, because the reality is not about equality and fairness and justice. The experience of each one of us is about change and differences. The conditioned realm, what we call samsara, is all about differences, about tribal differences, class differences, sexual differences, all the differences that we can imagine and identify with. And then that creates, from upper class, then we that identity can take us through life, always feeling better than the lower working classes. Or we can think working class, and we can carry that to the grave, that no matter how wealthy you become, you're still just working class member of society. Because these impressions are inculcated in our minds when we're quite young and innocent. And so we can hold to ideals which are beautiful and good, but you can't create ideal situations. In moments of our lives, everything seems ideal, but then it changes. And being brought up in the United States myself, you're brought up with this ideal of progress, which is a very pleasant idea. Everything's going to get better and better, and all the injustices are going to be resolved, all the racial tensions, the class identities, the gender identities will all fade away into just a total fair ideal that we can long for or imagine. But is that the way we experience life in our daily life, here and now? Learning to live with other people always takes a certain amount of wisdom, because we have to accept differences. When we're young, we get married and we have ideals about perfect relationship, progressing in time into a permanent feeling of love and affection. But that's an ideal way of thinking that can be a belief. But the realities of living with any other person than yourself is that you've got to adapt to different ways of thinking, different expectations, different attitudes, if you're going to live together. So I pointed out to the traditional Sangha here at Temple Forest Monastery of the conformity is about action and speech. The Vinaya discipline that we adhere to is a traditional discipline, but it's only about action and speech. Right and wrong, acceptable, unacceptable perceptions that are created through these precepts that we call the Vinaya. And so in one way the Sangha works because on action and speech, we pretty much on the same track. But in terms of meditation, it's when you practice meditation, you kind of think because you have these insights or these understandings that everyone else should. And so in the monastic life, Ajahn, Jetavana, and Nando have experienced disappointment when their efforts at pointing to Dhamma get totally misunderstood. Or people reach a wall and think I am not progressing anymore, so I'm disrobing, is one way of responding to that perception of the wall and lack of progress. But also, a wall is a perception. No matter how I feel, if I interpret my experience of meditation as I've hit the wall, I can't get beyond it, that's the reality that I'm experiencing through thinking, through feeling, through emotion, because all my efforts at meditation aren't getting me anywhere that I would like to go. I'm just stuck in this valley of despair, or this permanent. Every time I sit down to meditate, I just feel depressed, or I can't get tranquil anymore, or we go on and on like that, without realizing that in every moment, whether it's you feel you're really getting somewhere with meditation or you're not getting anywhere, you hit a wall, these are concepts that you cling to, identify with. So maybe in terms of progress, is that progress? Do we all hit walls? Yes. The kind of enthusiasm for a monastic life that we had in the beginning, it's a wall. It's no longer interesting, or we no longer feel enthusiastic about it. And is it because I'm not a good monk or I'm not progressing in the monastic life? I can hold to those views. Or I can just imagine, well, you don't have to be a monk to meditate. You can be a layperson, get married, have children, get a job, and live happily ever after. is a nice image when you hit the wall as a monk. But that's not really investigating the reality of here and now, because you're still operating from the separate self, the ego level. I am this person, I'm a Buddhist monk, and I've hit a wall, are all creations of the mind. They're not ultimate reality. They all arise and cease. And that's why this witnessing position of Buddho is a position of observing. Being fed up with monastic life is like this. Hitting a wall is like this. So you're kind of in this way of reflecting. You're not trying to judge it in any personal way. It's no longer, I'm depressed, I'm not progressing. It's witnessing these concepts, these feelings of not progressing, of hitting a wall. And so they say, as it's like this, is a way of letting go of it. Because as we accept the fact that we're in a valley of despair, or we're disillusioned with everything, we can imagine a better life doing something else. And they're all what we call grist for the mill. They're all ways of important perceptions that we can create in the mind to recognize as impermanent and not self. So when you come to live in the West, when you've been ordained and trained in Thailand, which is a Buddhist country, it's very interesting. And for many of us, we get so much respect just because we're Buddhist monks. When we try to speak Thai, we don't make sense. And we're rather clumsy physically compared to Thais, which are very graceful people. But you get an enormous amount of respect, which is very nice for individually to take that very personally, to feel respected. And people, I used to reflect on generosity. I'm a foreigner, an American in a very traditional Thai monastery, and totally accepted and respected. One time when I was just a new monk, when I first met Luang Por Cha at Wat Pa Pong in Ubon, and there were 22 monks then at Wat Pa Pong, and I was at the end of the line. I was the 22nd monk. And Thai people would come in from the villages or the cities, and they'd go and pay respect to Ajahn Chah, and then they'd come over to me at the end of the line and pay respect to me. And I thought, what about all the other monks? My American mind went into more democratic perceptions of why me? I'm the newest. I can't even speak the language, and they're paying this kind of respect. And then I would take everything personally anyway. So I asked Ajahn, I said, I don't think it's right that they should come and pay respect to me unless they do it to the other monks who are senior to me. Because the whole structure is very hierarchical. Seniority gets the privileged position of first. So Lumo Chao told me, he said, you're just so impressed to see a foreigner, an American, in a robe. And they just want to let you know they're supporting you. So it was very moving, how one could look at it from a very democratic view. They shouldn't pay respect to me because I'm the newly ordained monk who can't even speak Thai. And that's how, the structural, the hierarchical structure works. But then Luang Por Chah is pointing to something else beyond the hierarchical structure, to just the culture of Thai, Northeast Thai, is very traditional, conservative part of Thailand, and so they really, and the Americans at that time, there's 1967, the Americans had a huge military presence in Ubon, the nearby city. So they always saw Americans as kind of riding around on flashy bicycles, and they had all these nightclubs and bars, and American GIs roaming the streets. And the Americans built the Ubon International Airfield in order to bomb Vietnam, and this was the height of the Vietnam War. And so when an young American ordains as a Buddhist monk in the most strict monastery in Thailand, as we all believed, that really impressed them. And so I felt this thing, this kind of reflecting on how respected I was just for being a monk was very moving and very touching. So it's a good way to kind of be introduced to monastic life in a Buddhist country. And 10 years later, I moved to England, and there, living in the city of London for 2 years, the first 2 years, going Bindabat in London, and living in a non-Buddhist country. People the British aren't really rude by nature, so they just try to ignore you. So, you go on to continental Europe and you get called all kinds of unpleasant names. I thought this was my experience. And then I remember we lived in northwest London in near Hampstead Heath, which is a very nice part of London. And there we go Bindabat on this huge heathland, and it's the highest point in the city of London. And a lot of heathland is uncultivated and so forth, so it's quite, for a forest monk, is quite a treasure to have this place to go to in the morning. And then one morning on Bindabat, I was walking down the street going back to the Vihara, and this schoolboy was standing in my way. And schoolboys usually like to make fun of strange-looking people. So I was expecting him to cause some kind of trouble, but instead he he gave me the Y like this and asked me to stop and put in his apple from his school lunch in my arms. That was very moving. So years later, I met him, and he told me he was that boy, and I said, "What motivated you to do that? Because it's not your culture. You don't know what most English people in London thought it was a drum." We've been asked to play the drum. So, and then just these kind of situations, then they're all ways of experience that you don't get rude behavior in Thailand, but in the Western world you can be called skinhead. That was one of the more pleasant names. And so, it was interesting you see, even when you're called weird and what are you doing here in our country, and you're trying to convert good Christians into Buddhists, and all kinds of perceptions that people can have about something totally different than what they're used to. But that's what I'm pointing at, is that the conditions can go from America to Mexico to the European countries or Africa, Asia, and we make value judgments when tourists can make value judgments about other cultures because that's not what they're used to. In America, we do it like this, and then that can be the standard of what's right. So using wisdom as our refuge, then we can be aware of that. We're not going to try to not feel prejudice or superior or unsympathetic to something different than what we're used to, but we're using our own emotional reactions to differences to be the witness of them. They are due to the various conditions in the present moment. This is what I feel. I can feel threatened. When I see the swastika, because I was brought up during the Second World War, I get a certain feeling that I was conditioned, as an innocent boy. As soon as you see that particular symbol, it's rather scary because you connect it with brutality and Nazis and so forth, and those were all perceptions that were acquired when I was a child. But in India, it's a sacred symbol. So you go to India and you see swastikas, and you can still feel the same kind of reaction that when you see one in England or Europe. But then being aware of that is just a habitual reaction. It's a condition. The conditions for fear arise because that's how we were conditioned when we were previously in our youth. And so wisdom allows us to observe. We're not trying to be perfect individuals with perfectly liberal, ideal attitudes towards everything, because then we can fool ourselves. But we're willing to use the way we are, the reactions we have, the way we've been conditioned for developing the path. So this word developing also implies progress. The path is always a symbol for having a beginning and an end, and so we have the Eightfold Path as the fourth noble truth. So we easily think of first I have to get right understanding and then right intention, and then right speech, right action, right livelihood, and on, like to right concentration and right wisdom. So right is very much a dualistic term. If right and wrong, they go together. So then, ask yourself, what is right understanding? The first perception of the Eightfold Path, right understanding. And then as you trust in awareness, in the witnessing position of Bhutto, here and now, this being a witness to what you're experiencing through your senses is like this, then you have insight. You begin to see things as they really are, rather than from the conditioning, social conditioning, religious conditioning, political conditioning. And then the Buddhist teaching is all conditions are impermanent. It's a wisdom, a statement of wisdom. It's the way things are. If you investigate life, investigate yourself, your body is impermanent. Your emotions are impermanent. Your senses, everything, your memories are impermanent. The conditioning that we receive, the ego is impermanent. The social conventions that we are conditioned by are impermanent. We begin to see the impermanent nature of samsara, the changing worldly experiences that we have through the bodies, through these separate bodies. So samadhi then becomes immediate. The Eightfold Path is no longer a path, it's here and now. It's no longer just, as soon as I get samadhi, then I can go on to Sangapo and things like that. That's the way the thinking mind works. It works in tandem with one A comes before B and onward like that. That's how we think, that's how the thinking mind operates. But samadhi isn't a thought, it's not a belief. It's an insight into reality the way it actually is. All conditions are impermanent. All Dhamma is anatta, not self, not separate self. So what does that leave you? Is the reality of Dhamma, of here and now, which is conscious awareness, and that's the gate to the deathless, the door that the Buddha pointed to in his teaching. The gate to the deathless is open. So a gate or a door is like an entrance. It always conveys, it's a symbol for the entrance into samadhi or right understanding. But it's actually beyond right understanding. Because we can have all kinds of views about Dhamma that we get from reading the scriptures or reading various Buddhist books or what teachers tell us. So we can think some teachers have wrong understanding and other teachers have right understanding. If you're teaching Dhamma according to the perceptions of the Pali Canon, that's right. And if it is presented in some other way, it's wrong. We can believe in right and wrong in terms of how we perceive our own tradition. But right and wrong are perceptions. It's not Dhamma, it's conditions that we are bound to out of ignorance, not understanding who we really are, what we really are. We tend to cling to perceptions about ourselves as a physical body, as a male or female, as an American, as a Thai, or all these are conventional forms. And that's all they are. They're not ultimate reality. They're not right understanding. So right understanding has no words. Apparent here and now, timeless, the way it is, or the best we can do with words. But then in terms of apparent here and now, what is apparent here and now? Wherever you are, what we see is going to change. So is it whether you're sick or healthy or awake or asleep, whether you're young or old, male or female, what is apparent here and now for all human beings? And it's recognizing the power of this witnessing, the Bhutto, the Buddha, knowing Dhamma the way it is. Dhamma is apparent here and now. And when I do that, then I realize consciousness is apparent here and now. And that consciousness isn't conditioned by culture, by the ego, by all the conditioning process that we acquire after we're born. And so then we begin to find a sense of metta, of loving kindness, of karuna, of compassion for others, of mudita, joy in life, and equanimity that come from wisdom rather than perceptions of unconditioned love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. Like those are words trying to convey, so I remember trying to spread metta, with the traditional form, and just by witnessing, I can think, may all beings be happy, may all beings be well, and as long as it was all beings, there's no problem. But then it came to individual beings, and then you feel something else. So it was, I remember at Amaravati, when Mrs. Thatcher was the Prime Minister, they lead a 10-day meditation retreat, and everybody's feeling metta for all the Chinese in China, and all the Russians, and the Soviet Union, and all the English, and then you mentioned Mrs. Thatcher. And there's this sudden freeze. It was palpable. So intellectually, it's easier to have metta for 7 billion Chinese who you don't know, who's somewhere over in China, than an irritating monk sitting next to you, breathing too hard. And this is awareness. Can you feel this same kind of ideal loving kindness for masses that are no threat at the present moment, but at the present moment there's something else is going on that you don't feel metta for? You can try to impose the words onto that, but in some part of you knows that it's just pretending, where awareness itself isn't a perception. It's not about loving kindness or loving everybody in some kind of personal, grand way of personal ability, but it's the natural way of Dhamma. Love is a word that's used for many things in the English language. So oftentimes it really means liking something or somebody very much. But then the conditions change. Then you don't love them anymore. Where metta, in terms of loving kindness, is what consciousness really is. Because we all share the same consciousness. It's not personal. And so it's an insight into unconditioned love that holds everything together. Love is a word that conveys, it holds things together. When there's love in a community, then the community holds together. Hatred is where we feel separate. We want to get rid of what we hate and don't like, and we want to experience this unconditioned love with what we like. But even that can change. So change is the word of the samsara, the conditioned realm that we're experiencing through these bodies. So like vipassana, the word vipassana, insight, meditation, looking into the way things are, rather than just believing in Buddhist terminologies. But the terminologies in the Pali Canon, in the suttas, they're not doctrinal positions that we take, but they're ways of investigating experience that break down the illusions that we're conditioned by. So I'll end here.